All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a question I'm sure many of you have thought about. Why did the USSR, after, those... So let's rewind a bit, go back to the late 1950s. The Cold War is, in full swing, and bam, out of nowhere, the USSR launches Sputnik, and then they put Laika the dog into orbit. And then just to just to one-up everyone, they send Yuri Gagarin, a real, live human being circling the Earth. I mean, what was the global reaction to all this happening?
You have to imagine, the world watching as the Soviets are achieving these monumental firsts. It really sent shockwaves through, especially the U.S. and the West. These weren't just scientific advancements. They became potent symbols in this global ideological battle of the Cold War. It was almost like it was validating communism itself, this idea of Soviet technological superiority.
Yeah, it was like this huge propaganda victory for them.
Absolutely.
I mean, Erickson even quotes Mao Zedong's reaction to Sputnik. He said that the east wind would surely prevail over the west wind, which, I mean, that really captures the global impact at this moment, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So how did the U.S. respond to this Sputnik shock, as they called it?
There was definitely this sense of urgency, oh, wow, we've been caught off guard, right? And it wasn't just national pride. There was this genuine fear that the Soviets were gaining a real strategic military advantage.
Yeah, you can see how that fear would creep in. So that's where President Kennedy comes in, right? With this bold vision, this idea of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. I mean, that must have been a complete game changer. But how did that even come about? How did they land on that idea?
Well, Kennedy needed a way to restore confidence in American ingenuity, to show the world that the U.S. was still a leading force. And here's where it gets really interesting. It was actually Wernher von Braun, the German rocket scientist who, had worked for the Nazi regime.
Oh, wow.
He was the one who convinced Kennedy that a moon landing was the way to go.
Wait, hold on. Von Braun, a former enemy of the U.S., played a key role in shaping the U.S. space program. That's fascinating. Why a moon landing specifically? It just seems like such a huge leap.
Yeah, and it may seem kind of counterintuitive. But von Braun, brilliant as he was, he recognized that a moon landing, although incredibly challenging, would actually play to American strengths because it would require this massive technological leap, right? One that would force the Soviets to compete on unfamiliar terms.
So he was essentially saying, let's shift the playing field to something that's more advantageous to us.
Exactly.
So what were those advantages that the U.S. had that the Soviets maybe didn't?
Well, the U.S. had this dynamic economy, a thriving private sector, and there was much more of a collaborative spirit between government agencies like NASA and these private contractors. And this adaptability and innovation, it proved to be absolutely crucial in the long run.
It's interesting because we often hear about the individual brilliance of people like Sergei Korolev, the mastermind behind Sputnik on the Soviet side. These weren't like average engineers, right?
Absolutely. Korolev was a visionary. But in a way, the Soviet space program became a victim of its own early success. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader at the time, he used these achievements as propaganda tools, constantly pushing for these spectacular firsts. And often that meant prioritizing spectacle over actual sustainable progress.
So it was like substance took a backseat to the show. But did that short-sighted approach ultimately hurt them?
Oh, in a big way. And a prime example of this is the Voskhod I mission in 1964. Khrushchev was determined to beat the Americans to having multiple people in space. So, to achieve this, they crammed 3 cosmonauts into a modified spacecraft.
Oh, wow.
It was incredibly risky, prioritizing this short-term propaganda victory over the safety of their own cosmonauts and really their long-term goals.
Yeah, that's putting a lot of pressure on those guys just to get, a headline, essentially. So were there other examples where this pressure for spectacle kind of overshadowed safety and long-term planning?
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't just an isolated incident. Erickson paints a pretty concerning picture of the inner workings of the Soviet space program.
So what were some of the key issues that plagued the program? It seems like there was more going on than just political pressure from Khrushchev.
One of the most detrimental factors was this intense rivalry between the different Soviet design bureaus. These were separate teams, often working on very similar projects, but there was minimal coordination. cooperation. Imagine a system where you have all these brilliant minds constantly competing for resources, undermining each other's work, and even hiding vital information just to protect their own turf.
It sounds almost like a scientific Cold War happening within their own system. I mean, how could such a system really foster innovation?
Right, and it's important to remember that this was a centralized authoritarian system. Khrushchev, he had a very hands-on approach, but he was relying on these design bureaus to deliver results, and as long as they were producing those spectacular firsts, he might not have fully grasped the extent of the dysfunction.
So we've got political pressure, bureaucratic infighting, a system that seems to kind of stifle genuine collaboration. But what about the economic side of things? I mean, building rockets is an incredibly expensive endeavor. Did the Soviets just run out of money?
This is where it gets really intriguing, because the USSR actually spent a higher percentage of their gross national product on space than the US did.
Wait, they spent more but still lost. How is that even possible?
Well, their economy was simply less efficient, resources were often wasted due to program duplication, and that lack of coordination between those competing design bureaus, that really hurt them. This inefficiency ultimately crippled their efforts despite their substantial investment.
It's not just about how much you spend, but it's about how you spend it. I mean, Erickson, he shares a pretty poignant anecdote in the chapter that kind of illustrates this whole point, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about a Moscow taxi driver who, points up at the sky and says, "There's our meat," which really highlights the public's growing frustration with the cost of the space program. It wasn't just some abstract economic concern. It was directly impacting people's lives.
It's a real trade-off, yeah.
Right.
So it wasn't just the money, but how that money was being used.
Yeah.
And it also seems like the lack of a robust civilian tech sector in the USSR played a role as well, right?
Absolutely. That's crucial. I mean, could a nation really excel in something as cutting edge as space exploration without a strong civilian technology sector? The U.S. really benefited from all those advancements made by private companies in things like miniaturization, electronics, advanced materials. And the Soviets, they really struggled to keep pace in those areas.
It's like they were trying to run this technological marathon, but they were wearing, lead shoes.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
So it makes you wonder, I mean, could they have overcome all these obstacles with a different approach? If things had been different, could they have, I don't know, won the race?
It's a question worth exploring. And to understand how all these internal issues really manifested, we need to look at their ambitious N-1 rocket project. This was the Soviet answer to the American Saturn V.
Ah, yes, the N-1. It's kind of legendary for its failures. What exactly went wrong there? Was it just like a purely technological shortcoming?
Well, the N-1 was definitely plagued by problems, many stemming from those technological constraints we were talking about. The Soviets really struggled to develop the miniaturized electronics that were crucial for a moon landing. Their electronics were heavier, their engines less powerful, and the overall design was just less reliable than the Saturn V.
So it was this combination of technical limitations, but maybe also a system that wasn't adapting quickly enough.
Yeah, exactly. And you also have to remember they were under immense pressure to catch up. And that led them to make some critical errors. For instance, they skipped crucial ground tests just to try and get the N-1 operational faster.
It seems like that old adage, haste makes waste, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as a rocket.
Oh, absolutely. And it really highlights the contrast in their approaches. The U.S., on the other hand, they had this very meticulous, almost obsessive approach to testing and safety. I mean, think about the Apollo 1 fire.
Right, a terrible tragedy, of course.
Yeah, but it led to this complete overhaul of safety procedures.
It forced them to really learn from those mistakes.
Exactly. And the U.S. system allowed for that transparency and learning from their mistakes. The Soviets, operating under this culture of secrecy and a fear of failure, they were much less likely to admit to mistakes and learn from them. And that secrecy, I think, was a major obstacle to innovation.
So while NASA was publicly dissecting every mishap, the Soviets were, sweeping their failures under the rug. That couldn't have been good for morale, let alone actual progress.
Not at all. It created an environment where problems just festered and bad decisions were compounded instead of being corrected.
And then, to add to all these growing challenges, you had the death of Korolev in 1966. I mean, he was such a pivotal figure in the Soviet space program.
It was a significant blow. He wasn't just a brilliant engineer. He was the driving force behind the whole program, the leader who could navigate those complexities of the Soviet system.
So not just a brilliant mind, but also a crucial like linchpin in that whole program. It's almost like losing the conductor in the middle of a symphony. So what happened? I mean, what happened to the Soviet space program after his death?
Well, he was succeeded by his deputy, Vasily Mishin. And while Mishin was undoubtedly a talented engineer, he lacked Korolev's political acumen and leadership skills, which were essential in that Soviet system. He faced a real uphill battle trying to fill Korolev's shoes.
Yeah, sounds like a nearly impossible task, especially with all the challenges the program was already facing. It's interesting. It feels like we're starting to untangle this web of factors that ultimately contributed to the USSR's, loss in the space race. But before we get too far ahead, I think it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what we've uncovered so far.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground, but I think we've just begun to scratch the surface of this fascinating story. There's much more to uncover, and we'll delve even deeper into these complexities in the next part of our deep dive. When we talk about Korolev's death in '66, it wasn't just a loss for the Soviet space program. It almost feels like a symptom of a much deeper issue within the Soviet system itself.
Hmm. That's an interesting way to look at it. What do you mean by that?
Well, think back to those Stalinist-era purges we talked about earlier, the ones that really decimated the ranks of scientists and engineers.
Yeah, really dark period for sure.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that like all in the past by the time the space race was happening?
It was, but the impact, it was long lasting. That culture of fear, that idea of not questioning authority, it permeated Soviet science and engineering for decades. Korolev himself, he was sent to a gulag back in 1938 based on these totally fabricated charges. And he suffered tremendously, both physically and psychologically.
Wow, I actually didn't know that about Korolev's personal experience. I mean, that kind of trauma, it must have had a profound effect on him and countless others who endured those horrors.
It created an environment where innovation was stifled. People were afraid to take risks, to challenge the established ways of doing things. I mean, can you imagine a program like Apollo, something so groundbreaking emerging from a system like that?
It's hard to imagine, yeah. It seems like even if Korolev had lived longer, the system itself was almost working against him. It's a tragic realization, but it's also a testament to his, resilience and determination that he was able to accomplish so much despite all those obstacles.
And he wasn't alone. Many other key figures in the Soviet space program, they had similar experiences. Glushko, the brilliant engine designer who, often clashed with Korolev, he was also denounced as an enemy of the people back in the '30s. Even Mishin, Korolev's successor, he was viewed with suspicion because of his family background.
It's almost astonishing that a system that inflicted so much trauma on its brightest minds could still achieve those early spaceflight successes. It seems almost paradoxical.
Right. It really speaks volumes about the talent and dedication of these individuals, but it also underscores the limitations of a system that ultimately was undermining its own potential.
It seems like we're seeing this recurring theme here. It wasn't just one single factor that led to the USSR's loss in the space race. It was this complex interplay of political pressure, bureaucratic infighting, technological limitations, and this lingering legacy of fear and secrecy.
And all of this, it was happening against the backdrop of a growing economic crisis in the USSR. Think back to that taxi driver's comment about the meat in the sky. It reflects this growing sense of discontent among the Soviet public about the cost of the space program.
Right. Priorities were definitely shifting. And while the U.S. was, pouring resources into Apollo, the Soviets were grappling with things like food shortages and a declining standard of living.
Yeah.
It must have been really difficult to justify funding a moonshot under those circumstances.
Exactly. And by the early 1970s, even within the Soviet leadership, there was this growing recognition that they had lost the race to the moon. Khrushchev, even though he was no longer in power, he acknowledged that American superiority was evident.
It's interesting because old habits die hard, right? Didn't the Soviets continue to pursue other really ambitious space projects even after the moon landing?
They did. They shifted their focus to space stations, seeing that as an area where they could still compete with the U.S. But even there, those same systemic flaws continued to plague them.
So it was more the same issues we've been talking about. Can you give us some specific examples of the challenges they faced with with these post-Apollo projects.
Sure. Well, take their Salyut program, which
Hmm.
was their first attempt at a space station. They experienced a series of technical failures, and this all culminated in the tragic Soyuz 11 mission in 1971, where three cosmonauts lost their lives during re-entry due to a faulty valve.
Wow.
It was a devastating setback for the Soviet space program.
It's heartbreaking to hear about these tragedies. It makes you wonder if the pressure to catch up, to keep pushing the limits, if that contributed to these accidents.
It's impossible to say for sure, but that constant pressure to keep pace with the U.S. it likely played a role.
Yeah. And they weren't just focused on space stations. They also developed the Buran space shuttle, right?
Yeah.
Their version of the American space shuttle. What happened with that project?
Well, the burn was another ambitious undertaking, but ultimately it was unsustainable. It only flew once, an unmanned test flight in 1988,
Hmm.
and soon after, as the Soviet Union itself began to unravel, the program was just abandoned.
It seems like a fitting end, almost symbolic of the Soviet Union's, diminishing power on the world stage.
Right.
It's a poignant, if somewhat bittersweet, conclusion to this chapter of space exploration history.
There's a lot to unpack there, but I think if we step back and look at the broader historical context, it's clear that the space race, it was much more than just a competition to see who could reach the moon first. It was a reflection of the larger Cold War rivalry, a clash of ideologies, systems, and ultimately ways of life.
Right. It reframes the entire narrative, doesn't it? It wasn't just about rockets and technology. It was about these competing visions for the future. So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I think it's worth considering this question. Was the outcome of the space race inevitable? Was the Soviet system simply incompatible with the kind of innovation and collaboration that's required for sustained success in such a complex and demanding field?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think exploring that question is really going to give us some valuable insights into not just the history of space exploration, but the very nature of innovation and progress itself.
It's interesting because we've been really focused on the reasons behind the USSR's loss in the space race. But it's important to acknowledge their achievements too, even in defeat. I mean, they really pushed the boundaries of human exploration. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I think, while we tend to focus on those early firsts, the Soviets, they continued to achieve significant milestones throughout the entire space race. Look at their robotic missions to Venus and Mars, for example. Remarkably successful.
Yeah, they really seem to have this knack for exploring those planets. And let's not forget, of course, their pioneering work in space station technology.
Absolutely. Their Salyut and Mir space stations, those were major accomplishments. I mean, they paved the way for the International Space Station we have today. They were real trailblazers when it came to long-duration spaceflight.
Right. So it's just a good reminder that the story's more nuanced than just a simple win or loss.
Mhm.
But it still kind of begs the question, could they have actually won the race ultimately if things had been different? Could they have achieved a different outcome if their system had been structured differently?
Well, that's really where we get to the heart of Ericsson's argument. He suggests that the Soviet system, with that centralized, authoritarian structure, was inherently at odds with the demands of something as complex as space exploration.
So too much top-down control, not enough room for individual initiative and creative problem solving. That's a pretty stark assessment of the Soviet system.
It is. But what's fascinating is that even within the Soviet Union, there were individuals who recognized these limitations. Ericsson, he quotes Khrushchev, in a moment of surprising candor, admitting to an organizational defect within their system.
Wow. So it sounds like even those in power were kind of grappling with the inherent contradictions of their own system. It wasn't just a matter of one system being good and the other bad.
No, it was much more complex than that. I think the space race was a product of its
Yeah.
time, shaped by these political ideologies, technological innovation, economic realities, and even, individual personalities.
It's like Erickson has presented us with this multifaceted puzzle. And as we, piece it together, we're gaining this deeper understanding, not just of this historical event, but also the dynamics of innovation and progress themselves.
Yeah. And the story, it continues to hold relevance even today. I mean, we're entering this new era of space exploration with multiple nations, private companies, all vying for a leading role. And the lessons of the U.S.-Soviet space race, they're more pertinent than ever.
So what are some of the key takeaways? What can we learn from this historical deep dive?
Well, I think one crucial lesson is that innovation, it really thrives in environments that foster collaboration, that encourage risk-taking and value transparency.
Which almost seems counterintuitive, right? You'd think that a top-down command and control approach would be more efficient, but
Hmm.
but history kind of suggests otherwise.
Exactly. Another takeaway, I think, is that this strong connection between the civilian and military sectors, it's crucial for technological progress, especially in a field like space exploration.
That cross-pollination of ideas and expertise, yeah.
Absolutely. And finally, I think a nation's approach to space exploration, its successes and its failures, they ultimately reflect its own values and priorities.
It becomes a mirror almost, reflecting the strengths and weaknesses of the society itself.
Precisely. And as we, venture further into the cosmos, it's a reflection worth contemplating.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the space race, here's a final thought-provoking question for everyone to consider. As the world, once again embraces the challenge of space exploration, what what kind of system will ultimately prove to be the most successful in this new space race? Will it be one that prioritizes national prestige, military dominance, or one that emphasizes international cooperation and the pursuit of scientific knowledge for the benefit of all humankind?
The answer, as always, lies in the choices we make today. And I think understanding the complexities of the past can really help us navigate the challenges and the opportunities of the future.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explore this fascinating chapter of history, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the archives.